Troubleshooting is a skill every owner should keep in their toolkit, not only to keep your camping trip on the road, but keep your camper out of an RV repair shop. You can diagnose your awning not only by what it is doing, but also by what it is not doing. So when you're going through your landing process and setting up your campsite, you may notice that your awning is not extending with that interior switch. Or when you go to turn on your LED light, it doesn't turn on also with the interior switch. And when you come out and look at this touchpad, you may notice a green blinking light next to this lock button. Those three things are indications that you have a level 1 fault. A level 1 fault is when your controller senses moisture in the 12-pin connection at the top to the harness. When it senses that moisture, it will give you that error code and lock out a few sections of your assembly. The level 1 fault does not lock out your interior switches forever. As long as your system has not sensed moisture for at least 100 seconds, you can come to the touch panel and press any button or power cycle your controller by turning it off and then back on, and that will clear the level 1 fault and you can use your system as normal. You can also experience what's called a level 2 fault, and this is when your controller senses moisture either in the controller or at the touchpad. The symptoms for this fault is that your extend switch, your light switch, and that green LED at the lock will also blink. The reason that your controller is preventing you from operating at the touchpad is because it's trying to prevent damage while the moisture is inside the system. To unlock the controller, you have to press the buttons in a specific sequence, and you do that by pressing extend, retract, the light switch, the wind sensor button, and then pressing and holding the lock button for 10 seconds or until that blinking lock button turns to a solid green light. After you've pressed that sequence, you can operate the awning, but after you have not pressed the button for 3 seconds, the system will automatically relock if it still senses any moisture in the control board or the touchpad. If your system continually senses a fault code 1 or fault code 2, you may need to perform a moisture mitigation procedure. You can find that documentation on our support site if you feel confident performing this, or you can contact a service center and they can perform it for you. If you're inspecting your touchpad to see if this procedure has been done, remove your touchpad and harness, and then you can check to see if any liquid tape sealer has been applied to your harness connections. While everything's disassembled, you can check for dielectric grease at your connection, and there should also be some in your control board. The last error code you might run into is the low voltage error code. You'll know it's a low voltage error code by the blinking LED light next to the lock button, and none of your functions will be locked out. So you may be able to extend your awning, but it will work intermittently. If you get this error code, you'll want to go to your battery and make sure that all of your connections are proper and in good condition and tight after travel. Then you can also make sure that you're charging your battery. If your battery is not maintaining a charge, it's a sign that it's no longer in good condition and will need replaced. Now, some of you may be thinking, Emily, I have a one control touch panel. Does that change what these error codes will mean to me? And the short answer is no. Your system might work intermittently, so you could have the one control panel extend your awning and stop halfway through. And that's because that moisture is preventing a good communication between your controller and your one control touch panel. Troubleshooting your awning doesn't stop with error codes. You can have multiple parts on your system that become damaged, or you just don't know what's happening. I want to go through your troubleshooting chart in your owner's manual so that you know what it means when it says verify the fuse is good or check your gas strut to make sure it's functioning properly. If you're having problems with your awning opening and closing, sometimes the simplest solution is the right solution. When you're operating your awning, Make sure you start from the beginning, and if you have a travel lock installed on your arm assembly, make sure that it is in the unlocked position and the arm can move freely. If you don't have a travel lock installed and you're not getting any power to your controller on your awnings assembly, you may want to go check to make sure that your battery is in good condition and all of your electrical connections are tight after travel. Another issue that can prevent your awning from functioning and operating properly is the thermal breaker located inside that drive head assembly at the motor. This thermal breaker is present to prevent the awning's motor from overheating. So when you're operating your awning, and whether you're extending or retracting, that motor can overheat and trip that breaker. And you will have to wait for your motor to cool down and that breaker to automatically reset to operate your awning again. The thermal breaker is not the only place that power can be interrupted to your awning. There's several fuses placed throughout your camper's wiring to prevent your awning from becoming damaged from shorts throughout your system. If you have an optional interior switch, you will have one fuse there, and then you will also have another fuse for your touchpad. Wiring for a camper can become basic or complicated, and it's dependent on your specific camper. So here we can have a battery, and your battery will supply power to your camper. Often that power will go to your converter or your distribution panel. Some people might call it a breaker box in general terms. And that power will go from the battery to that breaker box. Now that distribution panel will supply the power to different appliances throughout your camper, including your switches that will power your awning. Here would be an interior switch. You will have one power supply going to that switch, and then you will have your touchpad. So we have power going from our breaker box, our distribution panel, to our touchpad and to our interior switch, and both of those will supply power to our motor. And this will vary depending on your individual camper, but each of these will be individual power supply lines. And they will both need an inline fuse that will often be represented with a squiggle on wiring diagrams. And both of these fuses should be 15 amp fuses. This is what an inline fuse will look like, and it's a little box that will hold the blade fuse. For the awnings, it requires a 15 amp blade fuse. And you can get these at automotive stores or home centers, and they're very easy to replace. To replace it, you just grab your new one, and there's no specific orientation that you need to insert these. And you insert it, and then your fuse should be good. If your wiring goes through that distribution panel, you may have another fuse there that will be indicated with a red indication light that that fuse is blown and needs replaced. Sometimes they will be blown without that indication light. So you should always regularly go through and check all of your fuses to make sure your system has enough power to run any appliance. When you're troubleshooting your smart arm, there's a few different places that you can get power interruption. You should always have power going to your touchpad because it will have a main source of power coming directly either from your battery or your distribution panel. If you feel confident enough to remove access panels, find the wiring going to your smart arm. You can check for voltage coming to your smart arm and going out of your smart arm to your LED light. You'll want to have a multimeter and set that to direct current, which is the V with the dotted line and then the solid line. And we're always looking for that 12 to 13 volts direct current. Here with this thicker red wire and thicker black wire, this is your main power source going to your touch panel. These will always have connections, and if they don't, your awning will not function. To check that, you place your probes, red to the power, and then black to common or ground. Here you can see that we have that 13 volts direct current going to our touchpad. So that means your touchpad has power, it should light up, unlock, and function your awning as normal. The next place you can check is the power going to your LED. So our LED is going to receive power through this red and white wire from the touch panel. You can have a secondary source of signal to turn it on and off through this green wire, and that will go to the switch on the interior of your unit. And like we've previously talked about, that switch is going to do the opposite of what that touchpad does. So if your switch is on inside your unit, then it should be on outside as well, unless you already have your switch for your light turned on at the touchpad. Then it will do the opposite and turn your light off. So make sure that you have power going to your light, and then you can check for the voltage going to your light. And again, you should have that 13 volts direct current going to your light, and your light should be on. If your light is not on, when you have current going through these wires, that is a sign that your light is damaged and will need replaced. Other wires that you'll see over here are the wires going to your interior switch for extend and retract. When you check these wires, they should have their own individual power source. And you will check those by placing your probes into those wires and then activating the switch, either extend or retract, and you should get that 13 volts direct current again. Another issue you may run into with your electrical wiring is how your optional interior switches are wired. You may have switches that are labeled extend and retract or on and off for your LED light, and these can become crossed or wired backwards. This is a pretty easy repair to do. You can take your screw gun with the appropriate bit on it, remove the screws. Sometimes these will be installed on a monitor panel and the switch will pop out instead of being removed with screws. And you can see as I remove all of this wiring, we have 4 different connections that are made. Here we have our power coming in, we have our common ground, and then we have our power going out and our ground going out. These are all the connections that will go through that touchpad at your arm and then control the awning. This will send those signals, so when you press extend, it should extend, and when you press retract, it should retract. Sometimes these 2 wires or these 2 wires can be reversed. So always make sure you have the red going to a red wire, black with black, blue with red, and then our white wire going to our black wire. These 2 wires are going to our touch panel, and these 2 wires are receiving power from our power source. So if these are reversed, you can have a switch signal, and then if these are reversed, you can have a switch signal. If these wires are switched with these wires, your switch should not work. So if you feel confident in making this repair, you can take a picture of how your wires are currently done, switch the wires that you think are reversed, test your awning, and if it's working properly, that means you have completed the repair and you can replace your switch either on your monitor panel or back into the wall. The other switch that we have on the interior is our light switch. Ours is labeled on at the bottom and off at the top. It's important to remember that this switch does the opposite of what your touch panel is doing. And all this switch really does is take that power from your power source, sends a signal to your touch panel, and that will turn your light on and off. To check those connections, you remove this switch or you pop it out of the panel. Here you can see our switch that's labeled on at the bottom, off at the top. So when we want our light to be off, it would be flipped up. On would be down with the red showing. And we have our power coming in at the top, and then we have our power going out at the bottom. If you need to reverse these, make sure that your light is off at your touchpad and then off on your switch. Since ours is in the correct orientation, we can replace it and then add our screws back. And then make sure that switch is all the way in that panel. Following the electric current through your system, you can check whether a harness is good or not by checking if your controller is receiving power and if it's putting off power to specific components. You can check your controller is receiving power by taking off this holding clip, removing this wire cover, and then removing this cover as well. And here you can see the wire harness connected at that 12-pin connector to your touchpad. You remove your touchpad by pushing it to the side and pulling it out. You can see where it's connected to the IR sensor and it's connected to that 12-pin harness. To disconnect the harness, you press this tab at the top and pull it off. Once you have your touchpad controller removed, you can check the bottom of this harness with your multimeter. Make sure that it's set to the direct current voltage, which is the solid line, the dotted line, and the V. When you're looking for a specific pin on your wire harness, you will be able to see faint numbering at the top of this connection. Here you can see 1 very lightly and 7 also very lightly. So that means we have 1 through 6 across the top, and then 7 through 12 across the bottom. If we turn this around, we'll count over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We will put our power probe into 2 and our ground or common into 6. And we get that 13 volts of power coming through this harness, showing us that our harness is good. And if we're having problems with our controller, we may need to replace the controller. Now, if your controller is good and you're suspicious that you're having problems with your motor, you will have to go to the motor harness and check for power coming from the controller to the motor. When you're following the current through your wiring harness, after checking that touchpad is receiving power, you'll check to make sure that the touchpad is sending the power to your motor at the drive head assembly. To check that, you come up to this wire connection. Here we have the harness coming from the touchpad to the motor. This connection is where you would take it apart, use your probes from the multimeter, put the red lead on the red side, and then the common lead on the black side, and you would check for that 12.6 direct current voltage at this connection. To do that, you would have to hold your multimeter here and then have somebody else press the extend or retract switch either at the interior of your unit or at the touchpad. If you are getting that current, but your motor is not functioning properly, that shows you that the touchpad is sending the signals through the wire harness and that the wire harness and touchpad are in good condition, but your motor may need to be replaced. The wind sensor is an optional sensor. You may or may not already have this installed on your system, just like the IR sensor. Below the drive head assembly is where you will find your wind sensor. The wind sensor senses the vibration throughout your assembly and will automatically retract if you have that set at your touchpad. It's connected at this wire connection, and you have a separate harness that goes from your wind sensor down to your touchpad. When your awning is extending, it should have a smooth, regular motion throughout the entire operation process. If you notice that your awning is wobbling, or if there's any excessive movement in any part of this assembly or the drive head assembly, you may have broken, bent, or damaged parts. The parts that you want to pay attention to are the bolts that connect the arm assembly together at the outer arm, the inner arm, and the mount arm. On these bolt assemblies, you should have a bolt on one side, a lock washer on the other. In between the arm assemblies, you should have wear collars. These wear collars are little plastic spacers that are on those bolts, and those maintain the space between each of the components for the arm assembly. Another part that could become damaged either by using your awning excessively and when you're not supposed to, like in severe weather, or accidentally extending your awning into a tree, you could bend the shaft that connects the drive head or the idler head assembly to the end cap on the roll tube. You can bend that shaft or bend that end cap out of placement and tilt it and give it an angle, and that will create a wobble while operating your awning. When you're retracting your awning to the travel position, you want to pay attention to how your arm assembly is closing around itself. Your outer arm should close just over your mount arm. It doesn't have to fully seal around where the outer arm is touching the wall of your camper. It just needs to see over that mount arm to protect the internal components of the arm assembly. If your arm is not closing fully, you need to check to make sure that all of your wire covers are in the proper place and not becoming caught in any of the components of the arm assembly. Make sure that you remove any debris like sticks or leaves that might have gotten caught in your system during your camping experience, and make sure that your awning fabric is in the correct orientation on that awning rail and that your mount arms were secured in the right place compared to your roll tube. All of these things can factor into how your awning extends and retracts and how those mount arms close. Taking a look at our arm assembly, you can tell that it closes completely from top to bottom. If your mount arm was not secured properly or your fabric was not secured in the right place, your outer arm would not fully close around your mount arm at the top. If you find that you need to correct the position of your fabric because it's causing your mount arm and your outer arm to not close fully, it can also create wrinkles or bunching of the fabric as your awning retracts itself. It is actually very easily fixed with an impact or a drill gun, the appropriate size bit, and a ladder. To fix it, you would take your screw gun and remove this hex head screw, and sometimes it will be below the awning or above. So make sure that you check your camper for the right orientation of that screw, whether it's below the awning or above the awning. And there will be two of these screws, one at the drive head assembly and then one at the idler head assembly. These screws will always be located about 1 to 2 inches away from the end of the poly cord of your awnings fabric. Once you have both of those screws removed, you can extend and retract your awning a few times, and that will help your awnings fabric to slide within that awning rail and make itself become square with the rest of your assembly and correct the bunching and wrinkling of your fabric. Once you're done with correcting the fabric, you need to make sure that you replace those screws through the awning rail. One at each end. You can either create a new hole or use the same hole that was previously there. An issue you could experience while your awning is in the extended position is drifting of the pitch. This can happen from a few different things. One is high wind. If there's excessive wind in your area while you're camping, that can cause your awnings assembly to move up and down. It is best to retract your awning in that case, but there's a few other things that could be happening with your awning as well. One is the gas strut. The seals of your gas strut can become worn over time. Just like brakes on a car, these need to be maintained and paid attention to make sure that your system operates properly. If this gas strut is failing, your awning will drift down, including after you've set your pitch of your awning. Another thing that can happen is this joint on your pitch arm can become loose, either from excessive wear or just over time, this joint loosening of you using your awning. When we pull our awning down, there's not a lot of resistance. That shows us that there's not a lot of friction on this hinge, and it will move easily when pressed on. When you're checking your pitch arm to make sure that this hinge is tight enough to maintain the pitch of your awning, you'll want to make sure the 3 washers that are inside this hinge are all in the correct location. When you check for the washers, you'll check from the hex nut side, And then you should see one washer, the plate for the pitch arm closest to your camper's wall, and then another washer, then your pitch arm that's closest to your awning's arm assembly, another washer on the other side of that as well, the plate for the arm closest to your camper's wall, and then the nut that contains that bolt and holds it in place. To tighten the pitch arm, you take a 1/2-inch wrench, put it on the bolt, and then you take a 6mm Allen key and twist in opposite directions to tighten that hinge until there's more friction so that it can maintain the pitch that you set for your awning. At the end of troubleshooting, if you find that you can't make the repairs necessary to your awning so that you can get back on the road, you can perform a manual override and then secure your awning in place to make it safe for travel. The things you need for your manual override is a drill, not an impact. If you use an impact, you can damage the gears within the awning motor. Also with your drill, you need a 7/16" socket, and you'll need a few zip ties to secure your awning into place. Your manual override nut is located at the drive head assembly, and to find that, you remove the rubber grommet and make sure you save the rubber grommet to replace later. Then you take your drill, insert it into the end of the drive head assembly, and counterclockwise or reversing the drill will retract the awning, and clockwise will extend the awning. You need to make sure that power going to your awning is disconnected because it can become excessively difficult or damage other parts of your system from backfeed of power. At the end of retracting your awning and before you move the drill from that override nut, you'll want to make sure that you are pushing on your awning and you are able to secure it in place with the zip ties to the bolts on the mount arm. So before I move this, I push back, remove the drill, take my zip ties, give myself enough slack that I can push my zip tie through, once you've fully secured your drive side assembly with those zip ties, you'll repeat the process on the idler side at that same mounting bolt on your arm assembly. And once you're done with that, you can take your rubber grommet and replace it to prevent your motor from becoming damaged from water intrusion.